The problem of consciousness has proven to be one of the most intractable problems in the history of philosophy. However, on close investigation, it appears that the answer to it may be deduced from the most elementary facts of basic epistemology. To see how this is realized, it is necessary to begin by investigating both the hard problem of consciousness and the interaction problem. The hard problem is the problem in materialism for how it is possible that a purely objective third-person material substrate, such as the brain, should cause or give rise to purely subjective first-person mentality. By comparison, the interaction problem is a problem in substance dualism for how it is possible for a substance with purely first-person subjective mental properties to cause effects in a substance with purely third-person material properties. If compared, these two problems are at root flip sides of the same underlying problem, an explanatory discontinuity between matter and mind.
One of the problems we have in discussing consciousness scientifically is that consciousness is irreducibly subjective. Now, this is a point that many philosophers have made, Thomas Nagel, John Searle, David Chalmers, while I don't agree with everything they've said about consciousness, I agree with them on this point, that consciousness is what it's like to be you. If there's an experiential, internal, qualitative dimension to any physical system, then that is consciousness. And we can't reduce the experiential side to talk of information processing and neurotransmitters and states of the brain in our case, because and people want to do this. Someone like Francis Crick said famously, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons." And that misses the fact that half of the reality we're talking about is the qualitative experiential side. So when you're trying to study human consciousness, for instance, by looking at states of the brain, all you can do is correlate experiential changes with changes in brain states. But no matter how tight these correlations become, that never gives you license to throw out the first-person experiential side. That'd be analogous to saying that if you just flipped a coin long enough, you would realize it had only one side.
In the case of the hard problem, premises about a material substrate must account for a conclusion about mental properties, whereas in the interaction problem, premises about a mental cause must account for a conclusion about a material effect. In any logical explanation, there must be explanatory continuity between the conclusion and its premises. For instance, any given argument will have a set of premises which proceed to some conclusion. To do this, it will go through a series of steps manipulating the terms in the premises through use of logical rules until the conclusion is arrived at by the manipulation of these terms. As such, only terms in the premises are allowed to show up in the conclusion. Likewise, if terms appear in the conclusion, then it follows that they must also be present in the premises. If they do not, then the terms in the conclusion that do not appear in the premises must have appeared somewhere in between for no logical reason. However, such a leap in logic is what is termed a non sequitur fallacy. When we apply this principle of explanatory continuity to problems in philosophy of mind, we see that any potential solution to either the hard problem or the interaction problem is doomed from the start. In the case of the hard problem, any potential solution must have premises containing terms about purely material objects with no mental terms, and a conclusion containing mental terms. Likewise, any potential solution to the interaction problem must necessarily have premises containing terms about mental causes with no material terms, and a conclusion containing terms about material effects. Any conceivable solution to either of these two problems must necessarily contain a non sequitur fallacy. As such, both materialism and dualism must be ruled out as logically impossible. But if this is the case, how can we use explanatory continuity to solve the problem of consciousness? The answer is to determine what the terms of the first principles must be about. Once we have established that, the terms in the conclusion must have the same ontology as the terms in the first principles. The question then becomes, do we logically start with material premises or mental premises? For this, all we need to do is to turn to foundationalist epistemology to determine what the ultimate first principles of any explanation will necessarily be. We do this by doubting all that can be logically doubted and accepting what cannot be logically doubted as foundational. When we do this, the first thing that springs to mind is the Cartesian statement about the ego or I, which cannot be doubted. Other examples would include statements about Platonic forms, or if you would rather prefer, ideas, as well as statements about primary sensory data. Of course, in the case of sensory data or perceptions, it is the perceptions themselves that are indubitable, and not what is supposedly on the other side of them, as external world skepticism is logically possible. However, all of these statements are statements about mental things. The Cartesian ego, or I, is a mind. Forms or ideas are mental objects contained within the mind, and sensory data or perceptions are intrinsically subjective first-person mental impressions. The material world, however, lies on the other side of the sensory divide, in what Kant would refer to as the noumenon. Given that it can be doubted, statements about the outside world cannot be used as first principles in any ultimate explanation. Thus, the first principles behind any ultimate explanation are necessarily statements about mental items, as that is all one is able to refer to prior to solving the problem of external world skepticism. And of course, first principles are at the foundation of any ultimate explanation. Thus, to count as true knowledge in the rigorous justified true belief sense, all knowledge must, at least ultimately, be justified by first principles. At this point, we can formulate an argument using nothing more than foundationalist epistemology, a little logic, and the principle of sufficient reason, which states that everything must have a logical reason. Premise 1. The terms and conclusions must be found in their premises. Premise 2. The terms of first principles only refer to objects with mental ontology. Conclusion 1. Conclusions using first principles as premises must only be about objects with mental ontology. Premise 3. Everything must have explanations that logically follow from first principles. Conclusion 2. Everything must have mental ontology. In theory, this argument can be made even shorter. Premise 1. The terms in first principles only refer to objects with mental ontology. Premise 2. The terms in all conclusions about everything containing true knowledge must be found in first principles. Conclusion 1. Everything, or at least everything knowable, must have mental ontology. Given how directly this flows from epistemology, one finds that it is logically impossible to refute. Any attempt to do so will automatically fall into one of two logical fallacies. If one rejects the first premise, one ultimately has one's arguments grounded on unproven assertions, but to do so is to commit the bare assertion fallacy. This even holds if one is holding to unproven premises for pragmatic reasons, such as the unproven belief in the materiality of the outside world. If, however, one rejects the second premise, one automatically commits the non sequitur fallacy, as one would then have terms in the conclusions that do not logically follow from the terms in the premises. Thus, to make any knowledge claim, one must fall into one of three camps: the bare assertion camp, the non sequitur camp, or one must accept the conclusion and fall into the idealism camp. One could perhaps claim that we cannot have knowledge of the outside world, and thereby fall into a fourth camp, that of the transcendental idealism of Immanuel Kant. However, to do so would violate the PSR, as well as cut one off, even in principle, from being able to claim that one's senses are at all logically related to an outside world. And perhaps this would reveal an ultimate irony. An external world that can be studied by science can only exist if said external world is mental, so as to be logically relatable to our senses.
The world consists of conscious agents, so what you see is not space and time and physical stuff. It's other conscious agents, and your interface is just presenting you that interaction in space as a space-time desktop.
In other words, for science to even be possible, idealism must be true. If you like this video, subscribe and support me on Patreon. And don't forget to check out the books in my Alaris novel series, Alaris, The Lances of Light, and Alaris, The Pearl of Heaven, on Amazon Kindle in the description below. You can find us on Facebook as well, at Idealism and Science versus Atheism.